Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's Countdown to CMMC webinar. My name is Justin Graham, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. I'm the manager of the Tevora Federal Practice, which includes assessment and certification services around FISMA, NIST 853, 171, FedRAMP, StateRAMP, and of course, as it's relevant to today's conversation, CMMC. The format of today's discussion will be Q&A, and we're going to discuss topics such as what is CMMC 2.0, how is it different from the original, why is it important for their business, when does it go into effect, and when should I start preparing for CMMC compliance. Let me go ahead and introduce our panelists for today's webinar. I'll start with Derek Loper. Derek is the Associate Manager on the Tevora Federal Practice. How are you doing today, Derek?
Doing well, Justin. Thanks for asking. How are you?
Doing great. I also want to introduce Alex Adams, who's a Senior Associate on the Tevora Federal team. Alex, you ready to talk some CMMC today?
Always, Justin.
All right, as a reminder, today's format is Q&A, so if any attendees have any questions they would like to add to the conversation, feel free to drop your questions into the chat, and I'll address them as they come in. So let's go ahead and get started, Derek. I want to start with you. There have been a lot of questions around CMMC 2.0. Can you go into when does CMMC 2.0 go into effect, and also when should I start preparing for CMMC compliance?
Good question there. So CMMC, the proposed rule was published back at the end of December of last year. There was a 60-day comment period that ended about 3 weeks ago or so. So if everything continues on schedule, we're looking at an effective date around Q3, Q4 2025. And as far as when organizations should start preparing, that time is really going to be now. At minimum, I think companies should really start determining the scope of their CMMC environment and really trying to ascertain what type of documentation or implementations that they're going to have required for their levels. And then really just start looking at those privacy and security controls and do some sort of a current state analysis just to get some insight into that level of effort for CMMC at whatever level they're going to be at, which there's about 3 levels.
Okay, yeah, I think I agree. And when you look at the total timeline, right? So if you're just now getting the requirements that CMMC certification is going to be a requirement for your organization, you have to do a readiness assessment first, right? You have to prepare. And then what happens when you do this readiness work? You find some remediation you have to do, right? That adds to the timeline. And then, of course, the certification work, right? That builds into it. So, yeah, totally agree. Right now is a time to start that readiness portion of your CMMC journey. Derek, one other question for you that's related to that. When you look at CMMC 2.0, CMMC in general, who does this apply to?
Good question there. So according to the DoD instruction 8582.01, which is titled Security of Non-DoD Information Systems, Processing Unclassified Non-Public DoD Information. So organizations that are unclassified, non-DoD, that have those information systems, and to the extent that's applicable to any contracts or grants or any type of legal arrangement or agreements that they have with the DoD to process, store, and transmit that unclassified non-public DoD information. So it's going to be essentially any type of organizations that are going to have contracts with DoD components where they work directly with the DoD. And there's going to be some, there's always going to be a contract in place with them, and they'll work directly with the agency. And any services that they provide are typically tailored to the agency. I say that because there may be other organizations that may work indirectly with DoD components, maybe through a separate contractor, right? And so depending on what service they're offering, will depend on, will they be in scope for CMMC? So with that, any DoD contractor, there's going to be some security implications for their external service providers as well. So if they they being the non-DoD entity, use an external cloud service provider to process, store, transmit any CUI from DoD and the performance of their contracts, grants, or any of those agreements that they have. Then that non-DoD entity has to require of that service provider that they meet security requirements applicable to a FedRAMP moderate level baseline. So there's going to be some implications for, directly for, those contractors that are dealing directly and have contracts with the DoD. And there's also those implications with entities that, may provide services to those non-DoD entities.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Alex, I want to go to you next. Earlier, Derek mentioned there's different levels within CMMC. Can you kind of go into the difference between levels 1, 2, and 3?
I sure can. So at level 1, this will apply to any government subcontractor or subcontractor that is going to hold FCI, which is federal contract information, which includes both the contract itself as well as any other government information that is not meant for public release. At level 1, each organization has to implement 17 controls that are described in a FARS clause and perform a self-assessment to affirm that these controls are in place. And this corresponds to a pretty foundational level of cybersecurity and is believed to apply to about 2/3 of the defense industrial base. Above that, at level 2, it requires a much more mature program that implements all 110 controls from NIST 800-171, and that is for organizations that possess CUI-controlled unclassified information, which is typically in the form of controlled technical information, such as either research or specifications around defense or aerospace projects. And at level 2, this will require a certification from a third-party assessment organization. And it is estimated that about 1/3 of organizations will require level 2 assessment. And finally, level 3 is a very small number, about less than 1% of organizations that are considered to be critical to operation of the DoD. These organizations will be required to first achieve a level 2 certification state and then to interact directly with the DoD for assessment of 24 additional controls that will ensure the highest level of protection for the federal or for the DoD information and supply chain.
Got it. So you mentioned roughly 1/3 of organizations the CMMC applies to fall under that level 2, and that because they maintain CUI. Can you talk about what the process is for obtaining the level 2 certification?
Yes. So for organizations pursuing level 2 certification, the process begins by consulting with a registered practitioner organization or another consulting operation with deep experience in 800-171, CMMC, and DFARS in order to assess both the the CUI domain, so where in the company that CUI is going to reside, as well as some of the stickier controls, such as the system security plan. And after that assessment is complete, then it can take, depending on if this is an old information system that is being brought into compliance or one that was designed for handling of CUI from the beginning, it can take up to a year for larger organizations before achieving that readiness state, at which point you will meet with a CMMC third-party assessment organization to undergo the actual assessment, validate the controls are in place, and achieve a level 2 certification that is valid for 3 years. So to Derek's point, that is why it's important to begin the process now, in case your organization requires that full year's time in order to determine, remediate, and prepare for assessment.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, that makes sense to me. I want to shift gears just for a minute and go back to Derek here. I want to dive into the actual CMMC framework just a bit. I know there's a little bit of confusion about what builds the actual framework. Is it DFARS? Is it NIST 800-171? Derek, can you kind of break down what the difference is between DFARS 800-171 and CMMC for us?
Sure. So DFARS, the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement, it's a large regulatory document that consists of about 52 parts and 9 appendices. The purpose of that is to establish a program to manage the investments of the United States in technologies, programs, and products that support this national security strategy that's prescribed by the President in the National Security Act of 1947. In addition to that, it's to support the U.S. Armed Forces, right? And so it is all-encompassing of the federal acquisition and procurement processes. And so it includes things like any contracting activities or purchases or sales to foreign militaries, but also includes the scope of NATO, right? And so any cooperative projects that would fall under NATO will fall under DFARS. Also, one thing it does is it defines what is FCI and CUI. I think me and Alex have both thrown those terms around, a couple of times kind of throughout this conversation. But those are in 2 separate publications. So for DFARS 252.204/7012, which is titled Safeguarding Covered Defense Information and Cyber Incident Reporting, it defines CUI and its types, and I can cover them briefly here, but the 2 major types of CUI you're going to see are what is termed controlled technical information, and that's just really any technical information within military or space applications that's subject to controls on access, use, reproduction, modification, performance, disclosure, dissemination, and release. And then included within that covered defense information. So covered defense information is kind of like the broader term. CTI, which is controlled technical information, would fall under that. And so that's just any of that technical information or any other information that is described and listed in the CUI registry, which can be found at archives.gov. The other portion is the FAR 52204-21, which is basic safeguarding of covered information systems. And so that became effective. The most recent release is about a month ago, so the 23rd of February. And so what that defines FCI, which is federal contract information, that is information that is not intended for public release. It's provided by or generated by the government under a contract to develop or deliver a product or service to the government. But one key thing, does not include information provided by the government to the public, such as any information that are on public websites or any simple transactional information to process a payment or something of that sort. One thing that FAR does as well is it establishes the minimum security controls for federal contract information. NIST 800-171, which is titled Protecting Controlled Unclassified Information in Non-Federal Systems, is for use by federal agencies, right? And it's for them to have security requirements in place for protecting the confidentiality of CUI when that information is resident or stored in a non-federal system and or organization. And when there are no specific safeguarding requirements that are authorized by any laws, regulations, or policies, right? And so that's always going to go back to what that CUI registry in the archives.gov, right? So that's where we'll kind of see that at. But the requirements do not apply to non-federal organizations that are collecting or maintaining information on behalf of the agency or using or operating a system on behalf of the agency. Those types of organization are going to be more considered like a DoD information system, and is going to fall under the scope of NIST 853, according to the DoD instruction 8500.01, because DoD itself falls under NIST 853, but for contractors, it's NIST 800-171. Okay, and within NIST 800-171, all of the controls are treated at no less than a moderate impact level for confidentiality. So currently 171 is in revision 3. It's in its final public draft. So most likely that's going to be finalized before CMMC actually comes into effect. And it consists of about 17 control families that are aligned directly with NIST 853 Rev 3, which again is that standard for security and privacy for all federal systems. So what CMMC itself does, Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, it takes the FCI, the Federal Contract Information, and the CUI, Controlled Unclassified Information, and it essentially creates an assessment methodology for them both, right? And so according to the level that an entity or outside or non-DoD entity has or processes or stores information, CUI information, then that'll determine, what level they would fall in within a CMMC, whether it be level 1, level 2, or level 3. And at the end of this assessment, right, it's a regulation, an assessment, there's going to be a certification, right? And so there's also going to be, those annual requirements and continuous monitoring and those types of things. Whereas if you're looking at FARS, it's a regulation just for the processes and an overall strategy. But the CMMC is geared directly towards non-DoD entities and their compliance with federal regulations.
Awesome. A lot of takeaways there. Just to expand on that, right? If you're an organization, CMMC is applicable to your organization, that's all very helpful information to know. And it really sets the stage, the foundation for how you're going to implement these security controls to ultimately get that certification. The other side of that we typically get questions from organizations who are starting down this path deals with scoping, right? So when we now understand which security requirements are contained within CMMC framework, Derek, can you elaborate more on, from a scope perspective, does your entire organization need to be CMMC compliant, and how do you create those boundaries?
Yeah. So the short answer is no, but it really depends on, the structure of that organization. So if the organizations designate specific system components, for the processing, storage, and transmission of CUI, then they can limit the scope of the security requirements, ensuring that they've isolated all of those components into what's called a CUI security domain. And a CUI security domain is essentially what an authorization boundary is going to be for FedRAMP or FISMA. It's what a CDE or a cardholder data environment is for PCI. Is the scope of work for high trust assessment, right? So it's really just identifying all of the data flows, all the components involved in it, the processes, the technologies, the individuals that are a part of that process, and then isolating that from everything that's outside of where that CUI should be, right? And so all that really is you have to establish a well-defined boundary with controls in place, both from a documentation perspective, but also any mechanisms as well that may have to be implemented as well.
Got it. Thanks. Alex, I want to go to you now. I think we understand what the CMMC framework consists of. We've talked about scope, but a lot of the times when an organization implements these controls, they're going to be operated by a third-party MSP, right? So, for example, if you're using a cloud service provider for hosting purposes, any requirements that deal with the physical security of that infrastructure, that's the responsibility of your MSP to implement that control. So, Alex, can you go into how do you assess controls that are operated by a third-party MSP?
So currently they're assessed, within the context of your organization, possibly with the consultation of that MSP. But one of something that CMMC is trying to establish is some type of inheritance process similar to that used for FedRAMP. So specifically for CSPs leveraged by members of the Defense Industrial Base, there is an explicit requirement that they either be FedRAMP moderate authorized or that they be FedRAMP moderate equivalent, which was defined earlier this year as having undergone all of the steps and prepared all of the documentation for a FedRAMP authorization package, even if they have not formally gone through the process. So that involves assessment by a certified FedRAMP third-party assessment organization and creation of deliverables, including the customer responsibility matrix, which tells leveraging organizations which controls they can and cannot, or they can and cannot inherit, and any that are still partially the responsibility of that organization. For CMMC, the future state is that any subcontractor will be required to hold a CMMC certification level commensurate with the type of data they're receiving from the DoD contractor. So FCI holders, any contract information that they pass on to their subcontractors must go to level 1 certified organizations, and any CUI or security information can only go to level 2 certified organizations. And part of that will also include the creation of similar customer responsibility matrices. And this is a clarifying point that the DoD has to make as they process public comments and prepare the final rule, and is something that we're all paying close attention to for when the final details do emerge.
Got it. Yeah, thanks, Alex. Okay, we have a question here that came in through the chat. Derek, I'm going to throw it to you. Are there any specific areas that organizations struggle to implement controls?
Yep. So typically I see it in the area of scoping, so that initial scoping exercise. Generally, it seems it's a little more difficult for organizations to determine where the boundaries end for their CUI data, what's going to be in scope. For instance, maybe if the workstations, right? What is that going to be? What is the determining factor for whether or not they should be in scope? And then additionally, it's really their service providers or suppliers or any other additional contractors that they deal with. So their supply chain and then also their system and services acquisition, especially since there's a lot of requirements now and evidence-based submissions that they would have to provide for CMMC in those areas.
Yeah, I agree. I think when you talk about specific controls, I think supply chain has always been an area where organizations struggle. Third-party vendor management. It also really depends on the size of the organization. So for smaller organizations, we typically see somewhat of a struggle to implement controls around change management, configuration management. So it really depends on what size it is, how big of your tech team is in a lot of these areas. So with that, I think we're just about at the bottom of the hour, so we'll go ahead and call it a wrap. Thanks to everyone who attended. If anyone has any questions, feel free to reach out. My email address, jgraham@tevora.com. We understand navigating this complex CMMC certification path can be difficult, but we feel confident our experts can help you in every way, right? From readiness assessments, advising, remediation support, all the way up to the actual certification work. So please feel free to reach out if you have any additional questions. Thank you again for coming. Goodbye.